Welcome to rHatchery.live. My name is Jose Leal. I'm sitting here in my friend's cottage north of Toronto, Canada, where Cory was born, our guest today. I'm with my partner, Matt Perez, and Cory Doctorow. Welcome, Cory.
Thank you very much. Are you, which part of cottage country are you in? You in the Muskokas, Thousand Islands?
Georgina.
Georgina, very nice.
Yeah, so you
Been
know
bitten
the
by
area
many
well.
mosquitoes in that area.
There's lots of them. At this time of year, though, where it's pretty good. It's
Good.
starting to be at the stage where it doesn't happen.
Excellent.
So you're down in LA now, right?
In Burbank. So it's if you're a Torontonian, it's sort of the North York to Los Angeles's Toronto.
Right.
As what's her name? Sarah Palin liked to say, I can see Los Angeles from my front door.
Exactly.
It's just a few blocks down the road.
I just happened to be visiting family and friends here in Toronto, but I'm actually from Silicon Valley myself, as is Matt, and so it's kind of cool to be in a place where you were born.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your history. Born in Toronto and been authoring and writing and doing all kinds of other good stuff. Our audience may not know you.
I was born in Toronto. I had an extraordinary time. I was born at a very early age, and so I was thrust right into it. No, I was born in Toronto. My folks are technologists and educators and radicals, both of them involved in many political causes, both of them teachers. My dad was a computer scientist. So starting in the mid-'70s, we had teletype terminals with acoustic couplers in the house. My mom, who was teaching kindergarten at the time, would bring home 1,000-foot rolls of brown paper towel from the kindergarten bathroom, and we'd feed them into the teletype. I'd get 1,000 feet of computing up one side and another 1,000 on the other, and then it would go back to the school to be used as hand towels, and I'd have to wait until my mom could bring home some more. I was always a writer. Toronto is a great place to have been a science fiction writer. I'm just going to fix my camera here. That's a little better. Toronto is a great place to have been a science fiction writer growing up. Wonderful writer and critic and editor called Judith Merrill started what's now the largest science fiction reference collection in the world. It's called the Merrill Collection. She was writer in residence and would critique stories even for little kids. So I would start bringing her stories when I was 10, 11 years old. She had encouraged a local fan to start what's now the oldest science fiction bookstore in the world, a store called Baca, which always had lots of writers working there who were always willing to critique my manuscripts. And then I ended up, when one of those writers, Tanya Huff, quit to write full-time, I got her job. So I worked there. I also was involved in technology from early days. I was a multimedia programmer and a software developer, and then a Gopher developer, and then a web developer. And then I started a peer-to-peer free and open source search tool startup, moved to Silicon Valley, ended up working for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit that works on digital human rights. I'm now in my 22nd year with EFF. I was their European director. I lived in the UK and oversaw operations in 31 countries. And now I am what's called a special advisor, and I work on issues related to competition and interoperability. In the meantime, I've sold about 22, 23 books, mostly science fiction novels, but also lots of nonfiction. My latest one is The Internet Con from Verso, which came out 3 weeks ago. I wrote 8 books during lockdown. I write when I'm anxious. So this is the 3rd book in about a year, and there's 2 more in the next 6 months, and there's going to be more in the couple of years to come. So it's been a busy time for me. I'm one of the OG bloggers. I helped start a website called Boing Boing, which I still co-own. And then for the last 3 years, I've been writing my own website, solo project called pluralistic.net, which is kind of a multi-platform, free and open access, surveillance-free, analytics-free, near daily newsletter, which you can get links to at pluralistic.net, and which you can republish, including commercially, because it's all licensed Creative Commons attribution. I'm also the former European director of Creative Commons, and my first novel, Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, was the first novel ever released under Creative Commons.
Wow. So wow. The tech part and the radical part, it's genetic. It's not just something that you.
Yeah, it was in. I got it in my mother's milk. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. So today we're going to talk about seizing the means of computation. Tell us about what you mean by that, and how do we get our heads wrapped around?
Yeah. Well, look, I think lots of people are upset about big tech. Tom Eastman says, I'm old enough to remember a time when the internet wasn't 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And for me, that really captures it. And there's a lot of people who view big tech as the kind of inevitable consequence of like the great forces of history. And that the best we can do in a world where everything is dominated by a handful of very large firms is try to make those firms behave themselves. And in fact, maybe it's a feature and not a bug, because if there's problems that arise because of tech, whether that's the trade in disinformation or fraudulent products or bad conduct like harassment or so on and so on, then perhaps the public accountable entities like lawmakers or regulators who are interested in addressing those problems can do so more tractably once there's only 4 or 5 companies, because you can reach into those 4 or 5 companies, regulate them, force them to do what you want them to, and sort of turn them into an arm of the state. I mean, I think the first people to really get this were the NSA, who very famously deputized all of these firms to undertake surveillance for them, and intervened on behalf of those firms when there were attempts to create strong privacy laws, and were their partners in preventing it. This is something with a very long history. AT&T was almost broken up in the 1950s, but the Pentagon stepped in and said, "Oh, we'll lose the war in Korea if we don't have Ma Bell." Of course, they lost the war in Korea, but Ma Bell got another 30 years intact as a result. And I don't think that I think that those people are mistaken. I think that on the one hand, it wasn't the great forces of history that produced this extraordinary concentration. Tech is, by its nature, a very dynamic sector. The fact that we only know how to make one computer, which is the universal Turing complete von Neumann machine that can run every valid program, means that however you lock in customers, end users, business customers, or other stakeholders, someone else can write a program or make a tool that unlocks it. IBM can sell you a hard drive for your 360 mainframe at a 15,000% markup, and Fujitsu can make a plug compatible one at 100% markup or a 10% markup, and eat their lunch in the same way that Apple can prevent Microsoft's hegemony over operating systems and Office programs from driving Mac OS out of business by reverse engineering Microsoft Office and making a format compatible environment with the iWork suite, Pages, Numbers, and Keynote, so you can throw away your PC without throwing away your files, and you can use a Mac without sacrificing the ability to collaborate with Windows users. And in the same way that when Facebook started, they didn't ask MySpace users to come and admire the wallpaper at Facebook while they waited for their friends to join them. They gave them a scraper, a bot, where if you gave it your login and password, it would go to MySpace, pretend to be you, get all the messages that MySpace had in a queue for you, put them in your Facebook inbox, let you to reply to them there, and then push them back out to MySpace so that you could resolve these high switching costs. And that what has happened to create the environment that we're in now is that the tech firms were allowed to engage in conduct that historically would have been prohibited under competition law, as competition law itself was drawn down. And this is a process that's approximately speaking coterminal with the rise of the tech sector. Ronald Reagan goes on the campaign trail the year the Apple II Plus goes on sale. And every new PC, every new digital service that comes out in an environment that's even more permissive of monopolistic tactics than the environment that its predecessor was in. And as a result, you see these companies that buy all their competition or use predatory pricing to foreclose on new market entrants and do things that, just generally speaking, we would not have permitted. And whether that's, Mark Zuckerberg getting up in the middle of the night and sending his CFO an email saying, I know you think I'm overpaying for Instagram, but you need to understand people like Instagram better than Facebook. So we have to stop them from leaving. And the way we do that is by buying the place they prefer. Or whether it's Google, a company that made one excellent product a quarter of a century ago, a world-changing search engine, and then failed to make another successful product in-house for the next 25 years. Everything they made in-house, crashed and burned, from Google Video to all of those social media startups that they tried, to even their RSS reader, say nothing of their smart cities program and the Wi-Fi balloons and everything else they've done. But what they have done is bought all their rivals, right? They bought a mobile stack, an ad tech stack, a video platform, server management, documents, collaboration, maps, satellite photos, you name it, they bought it. They operationalized it, sure, but like that's not innovation, right? That's just operations. And I think that we didn't have to have tech companies that looked like this. We didn't have to have a tech landscape that looked like this, and that we cannot really get them to behave now that they look like this. That
Right.
when a sector degrades into just a handful of companies, they become very hard to regulate, partly because they're too big to fail, where anything that we do to them is just likely to have so much collateral damage that they can argue over and over again that they should be left to their own whims, as you see with Facebook whenever, or Amazon, whenever there's a complaint about how the targeted marketing of Facebook or the abusive conduct of Amazon is harming both end users and business customers, they will always be able to drum up a bunch of small businesses that say, look, we'd go out of business if it wasn't for Amazon and Facebook. They may be right, because they're so integrated. But at the same time, we can't afford to let them be the de facto regulators of whole swaths of our economy. They're not good at it, and no one is good at it, right? The problem isn't just that Mark Zuckerberg is a creep who, shouldn't be the self-elected czar for life of 3 billion people's online lives. It's that job shouldn't exist.
Right.
And so that brings me to the book, which I guess we'll talk about now, which describes how we got here, what opportunities we have to deal with that, and how we could build a new good internet that's a worthy successor to the old good internet we used to have, and take this current internet that we have, what I call the in-shitternet, and banish it to the scrap heap of history.
So, but before maybe we talk about the new internet,
Mm-hmm.
the reason we got here is because we've built a system of this internet where not only do we as individuals have to play in their ballpark, the society as a whole is just sort of narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. Why do you think that we've become so, diversity seems to disappear when it comes to the internet? Why do you think that happens?
Yeah, so I think the way to understand this is that first you get concentration. And the concentration, as I said, comes from a general change in the posture of competition regulators around the world to tolerate conduct that would have otherwise been intolerable, and that the statutes say is intolerable. So we just had not really a change in the law, but a change in enforcement posture. And that led to vast concentration in many sectors. So it's not just tech that is hugely concentrated. I'm wearing my union shirt today for my brothers and sisters on the picket line down the road from me at Warner, Disney, and Universal. They're in an extraordinarily concentrated sector, as am I, as a member of the entertainment industry. We have 5 major publishers, 4 major studios, 3 major labels, 2 companies that do all the ad tech supported media, and 1 company that controls all the ebooks and audiobooks. That's true everywhere you look. 3 cartels control all international shipping. There's about 5 major banks that control most of the world's finance. 2 companies control most of the world's beer. 2 companies control most of the world's spirits. 2 companies control most of the world's running shoes. 1 company controls most of the world's bottle caps, and 1 company controls most of the world's vitamin C. 1 company controls most of the world's eyeglasses.
I was going to say
a company
that,
called Luxottica Essilor. They own Bausch & Lomb. They own. They're the ones who make Dolce & Gabbana. They're the ones who make Coach and Oakley. They're Sunglass Hut. They're Lens Crafters, Sears Optical, Target Optical. They're also Essilor, which makes more than 50% of the optical lenses in the world. And they're iMed, which is the insurer that writes the majority of the world's eye insurance policies. So even if you find some internet hipster in a leather apron who gnaws your glasses frames themselves out of a whole log and makes your lenses in an artisanal forge, the insurer that's paying for them is still going to be Luxottica Essilor, and they've raised the price of glasses 1,000% in the last decade. When I was a kid, there were 30 professional wrestling leagues. Now there's 1. The owner, who's a rapey Trumpist billionaire, has reclassified all of his workers or misclassified all of his workers as contractors, took away their health insurance. All those wrestlers I grew up watching, they're on GoFundMe begging for pennies to die with dignity of their work-related injuries, right? So across the board, In tech, that market concentration not only reduces our choice, but it also produces regulatory capture, in which we get a surplus of laws that are bad and an absolute poverty of laws that are good. So we either don't have or don't enforce privacy laws, depending on whether you're in the US or in Europe. Our labor laws are flouted routinely because they say when your boss is an app, you're not a worker, you're a small business person. Our consumer protection laws don't exist online. A company that, like Amazon, you can go and search for a specific product, even down to the SKU or model number, and Amazon will take money from third parties to return a screen full of results that aren't that product and that look like it and that trick you into buying that product. And under normal circumstances, if you went into a store and you said, I need part XYZ, and they sold you a different part, that would be fraud. When Amazon does it, it's a $31 billion a year so-called advertising business, which is really a payola business. So we have no enforcement of the tech laws that we need. And then we have over-enforcement of the tech laws we desperately don't need, right? Which is laws that allow them to stop us from doing what tech industry businesses have done since the year dot, which is reverse engineer, adapt, and modify the products and services that we use. So, for example, if you have an open platform, you can always adapt it to block ads and tracking. 1 in 4 web users are, in fact, blocking ads. Doc Searles calls it the largest consumer boycott in human history. He's right. If you wanted to do that with an app, you would have to reverse engineer the app. And doing so is a violation of Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which Bill Clinton signed in 1998, which makes it a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine to bypass an access control for a copyrighted work, like the software for the app. And as a result, if you were to add an ad blocker to an app, you could go to prison, right? And so this goes across the board. If you, as a writer, if my books, because we're sold on Audible, which is Amazon's 90% monopoly audiobook platform, they're not, because I won't let them be sold there. If my books were sold there, Audible would require me to allow my books to be wrapped in their digital rights management, their digital locks. Removing those locks is a felony. So even I, the author, the proprietor of the copyright, who wrote the book, paid the narrator, paid the editor, and produced the book, I cannot authorize you, my customer, my audience member, to convert that file so you can play it in a non-Audible player and quit the platform, which means that Audible is able to lock me and you to the platform and abuse us both. They abuse you by raising prices, adding ads to audiobooks, which is a thing Audible is experimenting with. And they abuse me by stealing my wages. Audible was embroiled in a scandal last year called Audiblegate, in which at least $100 million was stolen from independent audiobook creators. And so you combine these 3 factors, right? You have a drawdown of antitrust enforcement that reduces choice. You have the drawdown of legal restrictions on the conduct of these firms that allows them to use the flexibility of a digital platform to endlessly change the rules in ways that would otherwise be unlawful, but which they can get away with by saying we did it with an app. And we have the increased enforcement of laws that stop us from taking measures to defend ourselves. And the combination is this monoculture you describe, where we are deprived of choice and deprived of the ability to create choice.
But is it?
So, Cory, before I mean, everything you're saying is music to my ears. It's the kind of stuff that we'll be saying different ways. We'll be saying pretty much the same thing. We published how many did we put? Oh, 1 book, and it's called Radical Companies. I'm supposed to plug it. It's the book, and if you read it, a lot of things would be familiar to you there. But what can we do differently? How can we rebuild this thing from where we are now? We have an alternative. We describe an alternative in the book, and a subsequent book, which is like a week away from being published. But really, there's the current environment, which we call fiat, which means because I say so. Move the box from the why? Because I say so. That's it. That's fiat. And
Computer says no.
Yeah.
Yep, that's it. And don't argue with it. And but the hard part is moving from one to the other, because in our view, it involves ownership. I mean, our ownership is so fucked up, screwed up, and the fact that we have these mega things belong to somebody like Zuckerberg is just plain. It goes against humanity. It goes against us. So that's one of the things that we have to fix. But that's a hard problem to fix. So how do we go from what we have now, what we can have if we wanted to?
So let me give you the good news and then the bad news. So the good news is that the intrinsic interoperability of technology means that all other things being equal, there's actually a pretty straightforward way to bring users from old systems into new ones. And that's to do a kind of ship of Theseus, where you replace one part of the system and then another and then another. And before you know it, the customers who, use their service, but your add-on are eventually just using your service. And historically, that's exactly how tech companies have grown.
Right.
The reason that historically new market entrants, right, which fancy economists speak for like startups, but also like co-ops and nonprofits and even, public agencies and whatever, the historically new market entrants could just look at an incumbent tech platform and say, where do you make your money, right? What is it that you do that has your highest margins? We're just going to offer, like, where do you impose the most pain on your customers and users? Right, whether that's through advertising or through price gouging or through opaque business arrangements. Look at Unity, right, and its recent and possibly rescinded new royalty scheme for independent game devs. Right, if you had a plug compatible runtime for Unity, one that would just like act like Unity, but that wasn't Unity. The same way that there's like more than one Java that will interpret your Java commands. This would be the moment. Right? You just turn around and you say, hey, Unity wants like $1 heptillion from the game sector for continuing to use its engine. How about you just recompile it with my engine and I'll just charge you $100, right? You would have all the money in the world, right? If you could make that offer. And indeed, like
actually Unity would buy me, would somehow bring me into their
ecosystem,
their environment.
Yeah. So, like all other things being equal, you would expect in a market where we were oriented around innovation, value creation, and respect for the public, that would be what would happen when Unity did this. But when we're oriented around something that economists call rent extraction or rent seeking, which is like when you make money not by making something useful, but by owning something someone else needs to make something useful, then it becomes much harder. And this is the bad news. The bad news is that we are living in a policy environment where if you were a third party and you tried to do that to Unity would come after you with claims of tortious interference, probably trademark violation, copyright violation, patent violation, anti-circumvention violations. They would work the refs. So, all of those apps are going through 2 app stores and like Steam and the Xbox store, and they would go to them and they would demand takedowns of all of that material. On the grounds that it violated their what is called IP, which some people say is a term that doesn't mean anything. I think IP is best understood as a term that business people use to mean any policy that allows me to control the conduct of my competitors, critics, and customers. And so they would say this is an IP violation. We demand that you remove it from these app stores and so on. So how do we get to the world where we can change the policy landscape so that the norms, the commerce, and the technology that are within our grasp right? Nobody likes what Unity has done. Normatively, Unity should be dead in the water. Technologically, it's not hard to reverse engineer it and make a different runtime for it. Commercially, it would be a smash success, and there would be investors lining up around the block to do it. But it's just policy that stands in the way. And so how do we fix the policy? Well, again, I have bad news and good news, right? The bad news is that individuals can't fix this policy, right? You can recycle with every hour that God sends as carefully as anyone can imagine. And without a policy change, the climate emergency is going to continue unchecked. Your kids are going to end up drinking their own urine. You know, there will be choking clouds of smoke. The coastal cities will drown. Zoonotic plagues will ravage our civilization, right? There's just nothing you can do to fix that, except as part
As an individual.
as an individual. But as a polity, we can make policy changes. So that's the bad news. The good news is, here's how policy changes get made by polities. And this is advice that comes from my archenemy. You should always learn from your enemies. My archenemy, he's dead. It's a guy called Milton Friedman. He was the architect of the neoliberal revolution. Basically, the reason we stopped enforcing anti-monopoly laws 40 years ago, along with like smashing unions and doing a bunch of other terrible things, allowing unlimited commercial contributions to political candidates, all that bad stuff. It all starts with Milton. And he was a crank, right? And he was a crank with an improbable idea, because his idea was, hey, the post-war prosperity and the New Deal took the vast proletarianized peasantry of the world and gave them a claim on social mobility so that they could hope to feed themselves, take vacations, send their kids to university, get their illnesses and injuries treated, not be maimed on the job, and then have a comfortable retirement. And he wanted to end all of that. He thought it was a bad idea. And people would say, like, Milton, nobody wants to go back to tugging their forelocks for their social betters. How are you going to make this bananas idea into reality? And he said, in time of crisis, ideas that are lying around can move from the periphery to the center. And our job as radicals is to have good ideas lying around until the impossible becomes the inevitable. And right now, the one thing we have an absolute abundance of in technology and in other domains is crisis. Everything is on fire all the goddamn time, because there is no way to run a social media network for 3 billion people that doesn't involve its continuous eruption into crisis. And when that crisis strikes, what we've done historically is the same thing we did last time, but harder, and hope for a better outcome. It has been a catastrophic failure. If you and me and the people around us who are knowledgeable about this stuff and care about it, locate the problem with the area where the problem is actually occurring, not with having the wrong people run tech monopolies, but with having tech monopolies at all. And if we talk about how we can resolve those tech monopolies with interoperability as an interim stage between tech monopolies and breakups, because breakups take forever, right? Monopolies are rich and powerful. They can fight breakups till the bitter end. IBM, when they were in antitrust hell from 1970 to 1982, for 12 consecutive years, spent more money on lawyers to fight the U.S. Department of Justice than the U.S. Department of Justice had to hire all the lawyers fighting all of its cases. They outspent the U.S. government for 12 consecutive years, right? So this is why we try to stop monopolies from forming, because once they're formed, they're very hard to get rid of. It took 69 years to break up AT&T. So yeah, we should be talking about breaking up tech companies, but while we're doing it, we should be talking about how we can use interoperability and other unique, distinctive, what lawyers would say, sui generis, right? Unique to the platform, remedies like interoperability that allow us to do things in tech that we can't do in health insurance or beer or professional wrestling, where we can unwind those monopolies piece by piece.
But I don't think it's the technology.
No,
problem.
It's not.
And I was at Sun Microsystem when Java started. One of my things was in the package that went out and stuff like that. It's not a technology problem; it's a people problem. I was chatting to my wife this morning, and women are chattel. I know that women don't like to hear that, but they are chattel. Mostly in their heads. Okay, the laws now have gotten out of the way as much as possible. A few a few women, relatively few women, are taking advantage of that. But for the most part, it's the shit they have in their heads that prevents them from doing that. So,
I,
so
I,
how do it's a
I
people
don't know.
problem. It's
I
not a
mean, look,
technology problem.
I don't know if I agree with your thesis about women. I agree that, you know, again, I hate using these big fancy words, but hegemony, right? Which is like when one system just like dominates everything. Hegemony does put a zap on your head. Steinbeck didn't say it, but he's quoted as being the guy who said, socialism will never take root in America because we see ourselves as a nation of temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And it is definitely true that, like, tech workers don't think of themselves as workers, right? And so, like, they have resisted labor organizing. Now that's changing because we went from this dream that was mostly a fantasy that you could work for a big dumb company like Sun for 3 years, but then go out and start a company that dethroned it. And then that fantasy was replaced by work for a big dumb company for 3 years and then do a startup that they acqui-hire as the world's least efficient way of getting a bonus. And then that changed into work for a big dumb company, but get a job for life with stock options and free kombucha. And like, they'll give you a massage every Wednesday. And now it's like work for a big dumb company, but keep looking over your shoulder because Google just fired 12,000 workers within 6 months of doing a stock buyback that would have paid their salary for the next 27 years, even as their product quality is at its lowest ebb in the history of the company, and they need all hands to fix it. And so, I think that now we are seeing tech workers understanding themselves as workers, and it's not a coincidence that we're seeing more labor organizing and solidaristic labor organizing. So, for example, you have Amazon tech workers in solidarity with Amazon warehouse workers, which is the other zap that they like to put on our heads. And they say, oh, you're a white collar worker. You're not like those
Right.
unskilled laborers. I mean, unskilled labor, I couldn't do that job. Are you kidding me? I'd be dead in a day, right? They have skills I completely lack, right? And so, I think that, like, there's lots of consciousness raising to be done, but consciousness can change pretty fast. And the one thing I want to be clear on here is that the kind of tech leader we have didn't get worse over the previous years. Sun, I know a little about Sun because I work for EFF, which was founded by John Gilmore, right? And so I've got some deep Sun ties here, and Sun was like a champion of interoperability and user freedom. That was its deal. I used to work for an SGI integrator, right? And Sun was like our greatest frenemy because they were always like making the stuff we made even cheaper to unlock our customers. But also, whenever we needed to use anything that like SGI wasn't making, Sun made it, and it always plugged into whatever we were using. And so we loved and hated Sun. But Sun, its founding executives, like Vinod Kosa, like the guy who said that no one should be allowed to use the public beach in front of his house, he's not a good guy, right? Like, that guy's a creep, right? What changed was not the caliber of the leader or the moral character of those leaders. It was the restraint, the discipline that was exercised by both the threat of regulation and the threat of competition. The fear that your customer could go elsewhere, or the fear that someone would stand up a new service that made it possible for your customer to go elsewhere. And with regulation now being what Jay Freeman calls felony contempt of business model, where you can mobilize copyright, patent, trademark, and so on to forestall any new market entrant, and with competitors having dwindled to nothing thanks to all those predatory acquisitions, including Sun now being, a distant memory left behind in the furthest outbuilding of Oracle. That now these firms, these people who are ordinary mediocrities, no better than you, no better than me, and no worse really, are able to yield to their worst impulses because they are not disciplined by those external forces.
Michael Linton in the comments says that it's not stupid people, it's the money, stupid.
Sure.
And
incentives matter, as our friends on the right like to remind us.
Exactly. And we've built a system where getting bigger makes sense. Making more money makes sense. The whole system is about more power and concentrated in fewer and fewer hands.
Yeah.
And that's what we've got, as we've been talking all along. But do we have a system where simply changing the policy is going to change our behavior? Because our behavior has been to follow that same structure. And our argument is that we need to actually do something fundamentally different, not using the current policy structures, but circumvent the policy structures altogether by creating new organizations that can do that.
Well, look, I don't know where you guys stand on like markets as efficient allocators. I'm kind of a skeptic of markets as efficient allocators, but I'll tell you what, even a skeptic like me, like Marx and Engels do in the Communist Manifesto, has to recognize that when you unleash markets, powerful things happen. I think all the people who are freaked out about the Communist Manifesto being taught in American universities have never read it, because like chapters 1 and 2 are just like, look at the amazing things capitalism can do. You've never met someone who is more enthusiastic about the power of capitalism than Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, but people tend to forget that. So I think that there is very little class solidarity among financiers, that people will be very happy to make money building that. Like the people who built, who invested in Facebook and got rich would be delighted to get rich again investing in Facebook ad blockers, right? They don't care, right? They didn't invest in Facebook because they hated privacy. They invested in Facebook because they loved money, right? And I think that if we unleash the potential for founding new firms that can make money by fulfilling the manifest desires of users, and users really want to leave those platforms. There's a reason that Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, and so on spend so much energy on preventing new market entrants. It's because they understand that if you could even try an alternative, that you go to it. I mean, I don't know if you guys are paying attention to the Google antitrust case that the DOJ has brought right now, but at its core is that Google is spending $45 billion per year to be the default search on every platform you might try, on the off chance that you might try something that you like better, right? They're lighting a whole ass Twitter on fire every year. People are like, Elon Musk spent so much money on something that was really dumb. Apple is spending that much money every single goddamn, or Google rather, is spending that much money every single goddamn year just to be sure that you won't try anything else. Now, maybe they're doing it because they love you and they understand that their products are so much better than everyone else's, and they don't want you to endure the pain of using an inferior product even for a minute. But I think that it's far more likely that they're doing it because they understand very keenly that the same thing that they did to Alta Vista and Ask Jeeves could happen to them in a hot second if people were allowed to try something different.
Can we do it in a scale that poses them, or do we need to start small? What's the structure of this movement?
Yeah, so the thing that we need to make sure of is that people can move from one service to the other easily. That's the most important piece of it. I don't know where you guys are on the whole Web3 crypto thing. I as a technical and economic matter, I think it's incoherent. But I think that the things that they said often rhymed with the things that I say. And in fact, I've keynoted a bunch of decentralized web conferences and an Ethereum conference and so on. I've been to all these different places where I meet these decentralizers, and they all have this like, we will build it and they will come attitude, right? We will make a better service. That service will be better and people will see that it's better and they'll leave. And what they fail to understand is that it not only has to be better than the existing service, it has to be so much better that it's worth giving up everything you have to part with in order to leave an existing service. And in social media, which is, I think, one of the more important areas here, although not the only important one, that's all of the people you love.
That's everybody.
Right? That's everybody, right? That is a lot to ask. And, I'm speaking to you today in English instead of in Russian because my grandmother, a Soviet refugee, gave up everything, right? Everything she owned and all contact with her family for 15 years. And as far as she knew, it might have been the rest of her life. When she was a child soldier who served in the siege of Leningrad, escaped across the winter ice to Siberia. In the second year, was inducted into the Red Army, and at 15 met my grandfather there, was knocked up by him. They deserted. They went to Azerbaijan. When the war ended, they made their way to Frankfurt, and then on a displaced person ship to Canada. And none of her family followed, right? They all could have. They all, like, things were in chaos at the end of the war. They all could have done it. My grandmother probably arguably had a harder time. She had a baby in her arms than her brother or her mother or her other relatives. They weren't willing to give up everyone that mattered to them. And so they stayed, right? Even though it caused privation for them in the moment, in the years since, and right now too. I don't want to tell you how bad things are for my family in the former Soviet Union right now. It's very bad in Russia. And there aren't many people who are willing to trade away everything they have and everyone that matters to them, even for something that's much better than their current situation, because that stuff matters. And so what we have to focus on is reducing those switching costs. And as I said, in technology, the switching cost, the natural switching cost in a digital technology is zero, because you can always make an interoperability layer, a compatibility layer, a conversion tool.
You switch from a people problem, leaving people behind, to a technology problem or interoperability. And that's the thing is interoperability and all that stuff is to me is the easy thing to do.
It's just illegal.
It's just illegal, but it's the easiest thing to do. The stuff that's between the ears.
I hear you saying that, but like the tech platforms don't act like they believe it. Right? The tech platforms act like if there was interoperability, people would rush for the exits. They put so much energy into fighting people who add compatibility layers, reverse engineer their products.
You're right. But the thing is, and by the way, we're not for markets.
I just don't know where you stand. I don't know what kind of. I don't know much about you guys.
Markets as they stand is never mind. It's a mess. The thing is to get people to do, like Jose said, a fundamental change of going from where they're at now, where my thesis is wrong, right? It's besides the point. Where they are now to something that's better for them. And David Marquet just wrote a book called "Leadership is Language," and it's an okay book. It's not as good as the first one.
the phrase every writer dreams of hearing.
But his first book, "Turning the Ship Around," is really good. But anyways, he's got one piece in there that people accept the profile of being good. I want to be good, and of course, good is defined by everything around you, not as opposed to get better.
Okay.
And that's a huge distinction in my book. And but how do you get people going? That's stuff.
So I think you got to make it. I think if the first step is a doozy, then then fewer people take it. Right? Like this is a thing that everyone who's ever made a successful product knows. Right? Is that onboarding is really important, right?
Yes.
So one of my early tech industry jobs that came out of my work with SGI was a CIO for a bunch of film houses, little film houses, working with cutters who had cut on analog film and then were switching over to Avid and using SGI boxes as like intermediate servers. And one of the things that Avid did was they had a keyboard layout that mapped onto the analog processes of physical film cutting, right? And it wasn't the most efficient way of doing it. That we had Premiere and we had other kind of next generation services that completely broke with those conventions. But what Avid did was they had this mode where you could take all of your tacit knowledge, all of your skills, import it over, and then bit by bit learn how to use the distinctive elements of digital that had no analog to analog computing, to analog film cutting, right? That were just completely, you couldn't analogize them to it. They were completely novel. And that journey of individual steps, I mean, I think about my grandmother's journey from the former Soviet Union to Canada, and then all of my perambulations where, you know, I started in Toronto, and then I moved to Central America, and then I was in San Francisco, and then I was in Toronto again, and then San Francisco, and then London, and then LA, and then London, and then LA, and then London, and now back in LA for 7 years, and I'm a US citizen. And I was able to make all those choices because I could do them a little bit at a time. I kind of oozed from one place to another, you know, splitting my time, having office space and, you know, a home or a mailbox in one place and then the other, going back and forth regularly. And then eventually I made the separation, right? And like, I like to think that if the situation for leaving Leningrad in 1945 had been like the situation for going from, say, San Francisco to Toronto now, where you could go and come back, stay in touch, keep your bank account, have a mover ship your stuff over or put it in storage, that a bunch more of my family would be living in Canada right now instead of in St. Petersburg, right? That it wasn't that they like lacked the mental fortitude, right? It was that the first step was such a doozy.
Right.
And, you know,
Yes.
I grew up in activist contexts. And so, you know, I cut my teeth like riding a bicycle around Toronto all night, pasting posters to telephone poles, right? Getting people out to protests, getting arrested, all of that stuff. And like when clicktivism started, right? When we started to create tools where you could sign a petition online or like display a banner to show your loyalty for a cause or whatever, a lot of people who were fellow travelers of mine, and even more who were just armchair quarterbacks, said, oh, well, this is nonsense, right? No one's going to make a difference this way. This is such a symbolic gesture. It's going to diffuse people's energy, right? People are going to go, I can do one thing. I could go to a sit-in and get arrested, or I could post a ribbon on my Twitter profile. I'm going to do the Twitter profile, and then I won't go to a sit-in and get arrested. And they said, no change will happen as a result of this, because we are just going to divert people from meaningful action to purely symbolic, empty gestures. And I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong as an organizer, and I think it's wrong as someone who's involved in these struggles. I think what that ribbon on your Twitter profile is it's the top end of a funnel. And that funnel, the easier that first step is, the wider the funnel is. And again, like everyone who's ever marketed a successful product knows that the bigger the top of your funnel is, the more people there are at the bottom of the funnel. And so casting a wide net by making these small steps that we can take, making it incremental, that's how we're going to evacuate the big tech platforms.
And you talked about I was just going to say, you talked about the technical interoperability, but what you've just described is really social interoperability, right? It's the ability to do those little things and still migrate towards that new platform, if you
leave Twitter and go to Mastodon and still stay in touch with people at Twitter. And you know what? If we created a law that said that Twitter had to stand that up, unlike other laws that we might pass about Twitter that it desperately needs, like don't abuse your users' privacy, or, you know, police harassment and real true threats or doxing or whatever, those are really hard to police, right? Like it's really hard to know if they're complying with the rule. And it's really even hard to know whether what the rule covers, right? If we say, oh, you mustn't harass people, then we have to argue about whether an individual element of conduct rises to the level of harassment. And then we also have to say, well, did they do everything that was technically feasible to prevent it, and so on? These are like fact intensive, hard questions. But if we say, hey, if Jose and Matt leave Twitter and go to like Cory.Mastodon and set up there and want to reconnect with all their friends, like the way that we find out whether Twitter is complying with it is by trying to send messages between them. And if they're not, we just go and we clobber them. We take, you know, like the GDPR does, like 5% of their annual global turnover per day of non-compliance. You know, that would be like a quite easy to administer remedy. And unlike other rules that say, like, for example, you have to police everything your users do, which requires that every startup have an army of moderators that none of the existing platforms had when they started, and would have prevented them from coming into existence if that had been the rule. A rule like this doesn't require any special expenditure for a new market entrant, whether you're developing new software from scratch or whether you are using off-the-shelf software. supporting ActivityPub isn't hard, right? It's like an open standard with reference code that's quite robust that anyone can download and implement for free. And so unlike the remedies that we currently propose when we try to make tech better instead of less important, this is something that would not fence out new market entrants, and that we could enforce without having to have these like crazy 7-year fact-intensive inquests where we depose every engineer to find out whether or not the company was living up to its promises or failing because the technology had reached its limit.
So we're going to do this at the technology level. We're going to do this at the cultural level, if you will.
Yeah.
And at what pace? When does this kick in? Because we've been talking about things like this for 20 years.
Well, we are at a turning point. And I should mention, we've gone a little long. I actually have another call starting in 5 minutes.
Then we should be wrapping this up.
We should be wrapping up. But I'll say we are at this turning point. There is more energy for doing something about this than there has been since the Carter years. And that's happening in the US, it's happening in Canada, in the UK, in the EU. Even the Chinese cyberspace directive is full of pro-competitive, pro-interoperability measures, because despite what Facebook will tell you, like China does not view its tech companies as national champions that it plans to take over the rest of the world with. China views those tech companies as competitors with the power of the state, and is throwing the leaders of those companies in gulags. Not a thing I endorse, for the record, but like, they're reining them in too. Everywhere you look, it's happening.
Yep.
Well, Cory, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank
you for joining us. It was not only cool talking to you, it was cool talking to you from where you were born, which is kind of special.
I wasn't born in cottage country.
Well, but
Toronto,
I'm sure you drank
yes,
a few beers up here.
I have indeed. Indeed. You have to replenish your fluids after the mosquitoes get you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you want them drunk as well, not just
yourself. That's right.
A real pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Lovely.
I know you got to run, so we'll just let our audience know that we don't have a guest to announce for next week, but it's coming up. So take a look and check it out. We'll see you next week.
I hear they got Elon Musk.
Oh, there you go. If you could give him a call, I'm sure all of those guys, you've got him on the hotline.
He blocked me on Twitter once. I don't know.
Have a great day. Thank you.
All right. You too.
It was a pleasure.
All right. Is this our wrap up here?